It was supposed to be a normal evening, just another quiet night at home. But when the emergency alert flashed on my phone screen telling me, "Do not answer the door," I had no idea how my world would soon unravel, and the knocking that followed would be the beginning of something far worse than I could ever imagine. The evening started like any other. I'd come home from a long day at work, looking forward to a quiet night alone in my house. The familiar sounds of the neighborhood filtered through the open windows, a dog barking, a car driving by. It was peaceful, even comforting. But something about tonight felt different. A weight in the air I couldn't shake. I made my way to the living room, flicking on the TV and sinking into the couch. The world outside was bathed in the golden light of the setting sun. For a brief moment, I let myself relax. But then, it happened. A strange stillness settled over the house, like the world was holding its breath. The usual hum of the refrigerator stopped. The ceiling fan, which had been gently whirring, went silent. Sat up, my heart skipping a beat. The house felt too quiet, and then I heard it. A faint tapping sound like someone was knocking at the door. I froze. Who could it be at this hour? I stood slowly, the hairs on the back of my neck prickling as the knocking continued. It wasn't a casual knock like a friend or a delivery. It was rhythmic, persistent. Each knock echoed in the silence of the house, growing louder. My pulse quickened, and my eyes flicked nervously toward the front door. I hadn't been expecting anyone. But when I looked out the window, all I saw was darkness. The street was empty. The knocking didn't stop. I swallowed hard, my body tense as I moved closer to the door. Something wasn't right, but I couldn't help myself. I had to open it. Just as my hand reached the doorknob, the knocking stopped. And then, an eerie silence followed. Too quiet. The silence felt heavy, suffocating. I stood by the door for what felt like hours, my heart racing in my chest. I had almost convinced myself that the knocking had just been some trick of my imagination when I heard it again, a single, sharp knock that shattered the eerie quiet. I flinched, my breath catching in my throat. This time, the knock came with a sense of finality, as if it were waiting for me to act. I pressed my ear against the door, heart hammering, desperate to hear anything that would explain this absurd situation. But there was only the deep, unsettling silence that followed the knock, the air pressing in around me like a living thing. I took a cautious step back, my eyes darting around the dimly lit hallway. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. My fingers tightened around the doorknob, but I couldn't bring myself to turn it. What was waiting for me on the other side? My breath came in shallow gasps, the sound of it filling the space around me. The knocking came again. Louder, more insistent. It wasn't just a knock anymore. It was a command. My body seemed frozen, unwilling to obey my mind's frantic pleas. Then, the knocking stopped. For a moment, I thought I had imagined it. But no, something was still there. I could feel it. The air had changed. There was a presence outside the door, pressing against it, as if it were waiting for me to open it. A shiver ran down my spine, and then a whisper, so soft I could barely hear it. "Let me in." My blood ran cold. I wasn't alone anymore. The words, "Let me in," still echoed in my mind, their chill wrapping around me like a suffocating fog. My hand shook as it hovered over the doorknob, but I couldn't bring myself to turn it. I pressed my back against the door, fighting to steady my breath, but the air felt heavy, thick, as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for me to make a choice. Then came the silence. It stretched on for an eternity, so thick and absolute that it felt like the entire world had stopped. No sounds of the night, no wind against the windows, no distant hum of traffic, just silence. But that was the problem. The silence was wrong. It felt too complete, as though it was pressing against me from all sides. It wasn't natural, wasn't safe. I strained my ears for any sound, anything. But the longer I stood there, the more suffocating the quiet became. I finally gathered the courage to step away from the door, my heart still pounding in my chest. The house seemed darker now, the shadows in the corners deeper, more oppressive. I tried to shake it off, tried to convince myself it was just my imagination running wild. But then I saw it. A flicker. A shadow that passed under the crack of the door, moving in ways that couldn't have been real. I froze. The air felt too cold now, too still, and my stomach churned with the sickening realization that something was watching me. Something was waiting. The knocking had stopped, but it didn't feel like relief. It felt like a countdown, the quiet before the storm. And I knew deep down whatever was out there, it wasn't done yet. Something darker was still coming, and it was getting closer. I couldn't take it anymore. The silence had stretched too long, and every corner of my home felt like it. It was closing in. My hands were clammy, my throat dry, but I forced myself to move. I didn't know what I was expecting, but I couldn't stay trapped in that room any longer. I reached for the light switch, hesitated for a moment, then flicked it on. The hallway stretched out in front of me, dark at the edges, the shadows shifting unnaturally. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel it, the oppressive weight of the stillness, the unseen eyes that followed my every move. With my heart hammering, I stepped forward, trying to ignore the creeping sense of dread that clawed at my insides. Then the phone rang. The shrill sound shattered the silence like glass breaking, making me freeze in place. I stared at the device. On the kitchen counter, its screen glowing in the dim light. The number was unfamiliar, but it felt too deliberate. I reached for it, the phone heavy in my shaking hand, my thumb hovering over the answer. Or button. Another knock at the door. This time, louder. I glanced at the door, my body frozen in place, the phone still in my hand. The knocking came again, this time with more force, like someone was trying to break in. My instincts screamed at me to answer the phone, to break free from this moment, but I was too afraid to do anything. It felt like a choice between two horrors, one that was already inside and one that was still outside. The phone continued to ring, its sound growing more insistent, like a pulse hammering in my ears. With trembling hands, I swiped to answer. Hello, my voice barely made it past my lips. The silence on the other end was thick, as if someone was waiting, listening, deciding if I was worthy of speaking. The seconds dragged on, stretching into an eternity. Then, a voice broke the stillness. Don't open the door, it whispered, a cold, guttural tone that sent ice running through my veins. It wasn't a warning, it was a command. Before I could respond, the line went dead. The knocking stopped immediately. But I knew, deep in my bones, it wasn't over. The silence returned, heavier than before, suffocating me. I wasn't safe. Not anymore. I stood in the dark hallway, my body frozen, the echo of the phone call still lingering in my head. Don't open the door, the words repeated in my mind like a mantra, and every part of me wanted to obey. But the knocking, louder now, more insistent, shoved aside my hesitation. It was relentless, each strike against the wood like a thunderclap reverberating through my chest. I glanced back at the door. My hand trembled as I reached for the light switch, the sudden illumination, making the room feel even more suffocating. The heavy silence from the phone call was still choking me. I could hear my heartbeat pounding in my ears as the seconds crawled by. Then another knock. I flinched, and my breath caught in my throat. Without thinking, I turned and moved toward the door. My hand was shaking, my fingers cold against the brass doorknob. I knew I shouldn't open it. The voice on the phone had warned me. But the knocking, the insistent tapping, was so real, so tangible. It was as if someone was on the other side, waiting, desperate. My hand gripped the knob harder, my heart pounding. And then, the knocking stopped. I held my breath. A faint scratching sound replaced it. Like nails dragging across wood, slowly I pulled. The door open, the hinges creaking under the pressure, the air inside the house thick with dread. There was nothing. Nothing but the empty, mist-choked night outside. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. But as I stared into the fog, I saw someone move in the distance. A figure, standing just at the edge of the porch. I stepped forward, barely able to see through the thick haze. The figure was tall, almost unnaturally so, standing still as if waiting for me to approach. My legs felt weak, my body unwilling to move closer. Mouth went dry. Then it moved closer, slowly. The figure's head tilted, the faintest sound of a breath escaping from its lips. And then I saw the thing that shattered my reality, the face. It was just beyond the light, half hidden in the fog, but unmistakable. Hollow eyes, skin too. Pale, lips drawn back in a grin. But the worst part, the part that made my stomach drop, was that the face was mine. A twisted version of me. A grotesque reflection of my own features, but wrong. So wrong. It smiled, a slow, eerie curl of its lips. And as it did, it whispered, "You shouldn't have opened the door." A sudden chill swept over me, and the room behind me seemed to close in, the walls tightening, pressing down on me. The door slammed shut, and I spun around, panic flooding my senses. But the worst part, it wasn't the face. It was the soft, distant voice coming from behind the mirrors. The question is simple: would you answer the door? Or would you listen to the warning? Now that you've read this far, ask yourself what would happen if this wasn't just a story. What if it was real? Are you certain no one's at your door right now? Or is something out there just waiting for you to make the wrong choice? They told me grief makes you hear things, phantom whispers in the still of night, echoes of memories, refusing to fade. But the tapping, that relentless tapping, wasn't in my head. It started at my grandmother's grave, and now it's here in my house. The first night I heard it, I was asleep. At least I think I was. I woke to the sound of faint tap, 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 as though someone were gently knocking on glass. My room was suffocatingly quiet except for that sound. And for a moment I thought it might just be rain. But when I turned toward the window, I saw nothing but the starless night. No branches were near enough to tap. The air was still. And yet, the tapping continued. I sat up in bed, my pulse quickening as I stared at the window. My breath fogged the air, and the sharp scent of damp earth filled my nostrils, though my room was dry. A sliver of moonlight spilled through the blinds, illuminating the empty floorboards and the old dresser near my closet. Nothing was out of place. But the tapping was there, steady and deliberate, as if someone or something was trying to get in. Tap, tap, tap. I hesitated, then swung my legs out of bed, the cold wood floor sending a shiver up my spine. Each step toward the window felt heavier than the last, like my body was trying to stop me from reaching it. When I finally drew the curtain back, my throat tightened. There was nothing there, just my reflection in the glass, wide-eyed and pale. But then it started again. Not on the window this time, on the wall behind me. Tap, tap, tap. I froze. My grandmother's face flashed in my mind, her voice whispering stories of spirits and shadows that wander when left undisturbed. The tapping grew louder, reverberating through the room as though the walls were hollow. My skin prickled as the air grew colder, impossibly cold. That's when I heard the whisper. Low, guttural, and close, so close it could have been in my ear. "Why did you dig it up?" I spun around, heart pounding, but the room was empty. My shadow stretched unnaturally long against the far wall, and for the first time I felt the terror that something else might be in here with me. Something watching, waiting. The next morning, I woke to find scratches on my bedroom wall, 3 long, jagged lines that hadn't in there the night before. My first thought was rats, but the marks were too deep, the spacing too deliberate. I told myself it didn't matter. I didn't have time to entertain ridiculous fears, but the fear followed me. That evening, as the sun set, the tapping began again. I was downstairs this time, cleaning up the dinner plates when I heard it a soft, rhythmic tap, 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 tap. It came from the living room. My stomach tightened. As I put the plates down, moving cautiously toward the sound, each step felt heavier than the last, my breath catching in my throat. The tapping stopped the moment I entered the room. The curtains fluttered slightly, even though the windows were closed. I stood there, staring at the empty room, waiting for anything to happen. Then, from the hallway behind me, came a loud crack, like wood splintering. I spun around, my heart racing. The hallway was dark, the shadows thick and impenetrable. The air felt colder there, a damp chill that clung to my skin. My mind raced. Was someone in the house? The thought was absurd. Every door was locked, every window shut. But the silence that followed was suffocating. I stepped forward, peering into the darkness, and froze. A faint shadow flickered against the wall at the far end of the hallway. It was tall, impossibly thin, and it moved not like a person, but like something, writhing, stretching. I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over my own feet. By the time I looked again, it was gone. That night, the tapping followed me to bed. Louder, closer, like it was just outside my door, waiting for me to let it in. That night, I decided I couldn't ignore it anymore. The tapping, the shadows, the overwhelming sense that I was being watched, it all led back to her grave. The thought made my chest tighten, but the only way to stop this was to go back. I needed answers. The cemetery was drenched in moonlight, the headstones glowing pale and cold. Every step felt wrong, like the earth beneath my feet resented my presence. As I approached my grandmother's grave, the air turned icy. My breath fogged in front of me, and then I heard it tap, tap, tap. Clear. Purposeful. It wasn't just coming from her gravestone. It was coming from beneath it. I stumbled backward, my legs trembling as I stared at the polished stone. The sound didn't stop. It grew. Louder, more insistent, like someone trapped was desperate to get out. My chest tightened, my instincts screaming at me to run. But instead, I dropped to my knees and started digging. The ground was harder than I expected, the soil packed tightly as though resisting my intrusion. My fingers ached, dirt caking under my nails. Every scrape of the trowel sent a jolt of dread through me, the sound sharp against the silence. Then, I hit something. Wood, small, like a box. With trembling hands, I unearthed it, a weathered wooden box, its edges cracked and damp. A foul, metallic smell wafted up as I opened it, revealing a tangle of old photos, a lock of hair, and a note, scrawled in my grandmother's handwriting. It won't let me go. Keep it buried, child, for both our sakes. The ground beneath me seemed to shudder, and a low whisper brushed past my ear. Too late. The tapping didn't stop. It was everywhere now. Inside me. When I got home, I felt it before I saw it. The air inside my house was thick, suffocating, as though the walls were holding their breath. My hands were still trembling from the graveyard, dirt caked under my nails, the box clutched against my chest. I told myself I'd lock it away, pretend I'd never touched it, but deep down, I knew it was too late. As I stepped into the living room, the lights flickered, throwing jagged shadows across the walls. The tapping started immediately, this time louder, more frenzied. It was coming from the walls, the ceiling, the floor. The sound surrounded me, a chaotic rhythm that made my ears ache. Tap, tap, tap. I turned, my eyes darting around the room. Who's there? My voice cracked, barely a whisper. The air seemed to ripple, and then I saw it. At first, it was just a shadow, faint and shifting in the corner of the room. But then it moved slowly, deliberately. My blood ran cold as it stepped into the flickering light. The thing was impossibly tall, its body stretched and twisted like something from a nightmare. Its limbs were long and thin, each movement unnatural, like a marionette pulled by invisible strings. Its face, or what should have been a face, was a blank void, a swirling darkness that seemed to pull the light into it. As it moved closer, the temperature in the room plummeted, frost forming along the edges of the window. Why the word barely escaped my lips before it tilted its head, a grotesque, jerking motion that made my stomach churn. Then it raised one skeletal hand and began tapping the edge of the table. Tap, tap, tap. I stumbled backward, my heart racing. Its head snapped toward me, and a voice, low and rasping, filled the room. You dug it up. The tapping stopped, but the silence was worse. It was waiting for me to run. The thing stood motionless, its void-like face fixed on me. My pulse thundered in my ears, drowning out everything but the echo of its words. You dug it up. My instincts screamed at me to run, but my legs felt like lead, frozen in place as it tapped the table once more. Tap, tap, tap. Then it moved, its lanky frame jerking forward like a broken puppet. I bolted, stumbling toward the kitchen, my breath ragged. The air grew colder with each step, my skin prickling as if the darkness itself was reaching for me. I slammed the door behind me and fumbled for the lock, but the tapping continued, this time on the other side of the door. Leave me alone, I screamed, my voice cracking. The sound stopped. Silence hung in the air, so heavy it pressed against my chest. Then, from the other side of the door, a low, guttural whisper slithered through the wood. You broke the seal. Now you must pay. Pay. I staggered back, my mind racing. The box, the words scrawled on my grandmother's note, they burned in my memory. She'd trapped it, buried it to keep us safe. I'd unleashed it. Desperate, I searched the kitchen, grabbing salt from the cupboard and the old iron poker from the fireplace. My grandmother's stories flashed through my mind, how salt and iron were the weapons of the old world, barriers against things that didn't belong. The door rattled, its hinges creaking under an invisible force. Shadows seeped through the cracks, writhing like smoke. I hurled the salt at the door frame, drawing a line across the threshold. The rattling stopped, and the room plunged into an unnatural stillness. My chest heaved, hope flickering in the corner of my terror. But then a new sound began, faint, chilling, unmistakable. Tap, tap, tap. This time it came from the ceiling. Above me. It was inside the house. And it wasn't going to stop. The tapping above me turned into a scraping sound, like nails being dragged across the wooden beams of the ceiling. I stood frozen, clutching the iron poker so tightly my knuckles ached. My breaths came in, short, shallow gasps as the noise shifted louder, closer, moving toward the stairs. It was coming down. I ran. My feet pounded against the floor as I raced for the front door. The shadows on the walls writhed, growing thicker, almost alive. The air felt like ice, and with every step, my chest tightened as if unseen. Hands were pressing against me. My shaking hands reached the door, but before I could twist the knob, it slammed shut with a deafening bang. Behind me, the scraping stopped. Slowly I turned. The entity stood at the bottom of the stairs, its skeletal frame stretched taller than before. Its arms unnaturally long, claws scraping the floor. Its featureless head tilted toward me, a sound like dry branches snapping echoing through the room. My stomach churned, and I took a step back, raising the poker. It laughed, a hollow, rasping sound that filled the house. You can't run, it whispered. You brought me here. You are mine. The box. My mind screamed the answer. I still had it. It was the only way. I lunged for the table where I'd left it. Fumbling to open the lid with trembling fingers, the entity moved fast, its shadowy form rushing toward me like a tide of darkness. I threw the salt across the floor, creating a thin barrier. The creature hissed, recoiling for a moment, but it wasn't enough. My hands shook as I grasped my grandmother's locket from the box. Her voice echoed in my mind. Offer forgiveness. Pray. But could I forgive what was about to kill me? The tapping started again, soft, deliberate, insidious. It came from all around me now, echoing inside my skull, louder with every heartbeat. I gripped the locket tighter, sinking to my knees. Tears blurred my vision, and I forced myself to speak. I forgive you, I choked out, my voice cracking. Whatever you are, whatever happened, I forgive you. The air shifted. For a moment, the house fell silent. The entity recoiled, its form twisting violently, the shadows splintering like fractured glass. A terrible, guttural scream filled the room, shaking the walls. My ears rang, and I clamped my hands over them, the locket falling to the floor. Then, just as quickly as it began, the scream stopped. The shadows retreated, curling into themselves until they vanished entirely. The room grew warm again, and the oppressive weight lifted from my chest. The box sat untouched on the table, its lid closed. I wanted to believe it was over, that I'd done enough. But as I sat in the quiet, I realized the tapping hadn't stopped. Faint, distant, it echoed through the house, coming not from the walls but from deep below. I stood frozen, the realization washing over me I hadn't buried it deep enough. It was still here, and it was still waiting. Now, as you finish reading this, listen carefully. Is your room silent, or is there a faint tapping you can't explain? Do you feel that? The cold breath on the back of your neck? Maybe you should turn around, just to be sure. When I found the dusty old VHS tape buried in a box at the thrift store, I didn't think twice about it. Label was blank, and the case was cracked, but the moment I held it, I felt a strange pull. I should have left it there. Now, every shadow in my house feels alive, and I don't think I'll survive the night. The box shouldn't have been there. It sat at the far corner of the thrift store, surrounded by dusty shelves and forgotten junk. The sign on it read, "Free, take at your own risk." I didn't think much of it at first, brushing it off as some kind of joke. But as I stepped closer, the air seemed to shift, growing colder, heavier, like something unseen had settled on my shoulders. Inside the box were old VHS tapes, their cases cracked and worn. Most were labeled in faded marker. Family vacations, reruns of sitcoms, but one stood out. Its label was blank, peeling at the edges. The plastic case was scratched, and a faint, dark smudge marked the corner, almost like a fingerprint. When I picked it up, a strange shiver ran through me. The tape felt oddly heavy, as if it held more than just magnetic film. I turned it over in my hands, hesitating, and for a brief second I thought I heard something, a faint, hollow whisper, too soft to make out. I should have put it back. I should have walked away. Instead, I slid it into my bag. As I left the store, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Shadows stretched unnaturally, long across the pavement, and the air carried a strange chill, despite the late afternoon sun. I glanced over. My shoulder, half expecting someone or something following me, but the street was empty. When I got home, the tape sat on the table, its blank label staring back at me like an unblinking eye. I told myself it was just a curiosity, just another thrift store find. But deep down, I knew better. Whatever this tape held, it wasn't meant to be seen. The tape hissed as the VHS player swallowed it, the screen filling with static. I leaned back on the couch, telling myself this was nothing, just an old, forgotten home movie. The clock on the wall ticked closer to midnight, and the faint hum of the machine seemed louder in the stillness of the room. The static on the screen faded, replaced by a black and white image of a room. It was empty, except for a single wooden chair in the center. The camera was shaky, as if held by unsteady hands, and the audio crackled with faint, broken whispers. I stared, waiting for something to happen. The chair didn't move. The whispers stayed just below the edge, part of comprehension, teasing me with half-formed words. The clock struck midnight, and my stomach churned as the screen flickered. The shadows in the corners of the room on the tape seemed darker, as if they were thickening, growing. Then the chair moved just slightly, an almost imperceptible shift. My pulse quickened. I told myself it was nothing, a trick of the old tape. But then the shadows began to creep. They crawled across the floor, toward the chair, their edges jagged and unnatural. I leaned forward, my breath shallow, unable to look away. The screen flickered again, and the camera angle changed. My chest tightened as I recognized the room, now shown on the screen. It was my living room. The same couch, the same coffee table, the same flickering lamp in the corner. I froze, unable to process what I was seeing. Then, on the screen, a shadow moved. It slithered across the floor toward the couch, toward me. Before I could react, the screen went black. The tape ejected itself with a loud click, and the room plunged into silence. But the shadow didn't disappear. It was still there, stretching toward my feet. The shadow stretched toward me, its edges flickering like flames snuffed out by wind. I scrambled off the couch, nearly tripping over the coffee table, my heart pounding so loud it drowned out everything else. My eyes were glued to the floor, watching the shadow crawl closer, its darkness impossibly deep, as if it were pulling light into itself. I backed into the corner of the room, clutching the edge of the couch for support. My shaking hands felt damp, sweat slicking my palms. "This isn't real," I whispered to no one. But the shadow kept moving, its inky form rippling, as if alive. The lamp in the corner flickered, its light stuttering like a dying heartbeat. I glanced up, and my stomach dropped. The shadows on the walls weren't still anymore. They writhed, twisting and stretching, forming shapes that shouldn't exist, spindly limbs, gaping voids where faces should be. The air grew colder. My breath fogged in front of me, and I could feel something watching me from the darkness. I grabbed my phone, fumbling to turn on the flashlight, but the light didn't help. If anything, it made the shadows grow darker, their shapes more defined. Then the whispers started, low and guttural, like dozens of voices murmuring just out of reach. They came from everywhere at once, surrounding me, invading the space. My chest tightened as the shadows crept up the walls, their forms clawing toward the ceiling. Something shifted behind me. I turned, and for a split second, I saw it, a figure, tall and thin, its body made entirely of shadows. Its hollow, featureless face tilted toward me, and a cold, hollow laugh filled the room. I ran, but the whispers followed, and the shadows stretched longer, closing in on every side. I drove blindly through the night, my hands trembling on the steering wheel. The shadows in the rearview mirror writhed unnaturally, stretching and twisting like they were trying to reach me. Every so often I thought I saw something, a dark, faceless figure standing just at the edge of the road, but when I blinked, it was gone. I didn't know where I was going, only that I needed to get away. But even as I sped down the empty streets, I could feel them following me. The air in the car grew cold, my breath fogging up the windows. The whispers were faint now, just a soft murmur in the back of my mind, but they were growing louder, pressing into my thoughts. The thrift store. It was the only place I could think of. The tape had come from there. Someone must have known what it was, where it came from. I pulled into the parking lot, skidding to a stop. The store was dark, its neon open sign flickering weakly. I banged on the glass door, my fists aching with the force. "Hello," my voice cracked. "I need to talk to someone. Please." A faint shuffle of movement came from the back of the store. An older woman, her face pale and drawn, unlocked the door. Her eyes widened when she saw me. "You played it," she whispered, stepping back. "What do you mean? What is this thing?" I demanded, my voice shaking. She hesitated, her gaze darting toward the shadows pooling under the nearest shelf. "It's not a tape," she said, her voice low. "It's a door." Her words froze me in place. The whispers were louder now, rising to a crescendo as the shadows crept closer, slipping under the threshold of the door behind me. The woman's words hung in the air like a death knell. "It's a door." The shadows surged through the crack under the door, spilling into the store like a black tide. They moved. Faster now, coiling up the walls and stretching across the floor, their jagged forms flickering with impossible speed. The woman screamed, stumbling backward, but the shadows swallowed her cry, dragging her into their depths. I backed into the counter, clutching at it like a lifeline. The whispers were deafening now, a chaotic symphony of voices hissing in a language I couldn't understand. My vision blurred, the air thick and cold. A dark figure stepped out of the swirling shadows, its elongated form towering over me. It didn't walk, it glided, its faceless head tilting toward me. My breath hitched as it raised a skeletal hand, pointing at me with fingers made of pure darkness. "This is your doing," the voices rasped, their words merging into one. "You opened the door. Now you must walk through." The ground beneath me cracked, the shadows spreading like veins. I felt myself falling, pulled into the darkness. The last thing I saw was the figure's hollow face, staring as the light disappeared. And then, nothing. I woke in darkness. For a moment, I thought I was still falling, my body weightless, suspended in that endless void. But as my senses returned, I realized I was lying on something cold and hard concrete, maybe? My breaths came, in shallow gasps, the air thick with the smell of damp earth and decay. I sat up, wincing as pain shot through my limbs. My surroundings were impossible to make out. There was no light, no sound, only a suffocating blackness that pressed in from all sides. Then I heard it, a faint tap, 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 echoing from somewhere far away. My stomach clenched as the memory rushed back. The tape, the shadows, the figure that dragged me into this place. I scrambled to my feet, heart pounding. The tapping grew louder, steady and deliberate, coming closer with each passing second. "Hello," my voice cracked, swallowed by the dark. The only answer was the tap, 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 now so close it felt like it was inside my skull. A faint glow appeared in the distance, a single pinpoint of light. Desperation drove me forward, my steps faltering as the floor beneath me seemed to shift and ripple. The light grew brighter, revealing the chair. From the tape, it sat in the center of an empty, endless room, its wood splintered and wet with something dark. The shadows slithered toward the chair, pooling at its base. My legs locked as a figure rose from the darkness, its hollow face turning toward me. The whispers began again. They weren't words, but I understood them all the same. "You are part of it now." The light blinked out, and the tapping started behind me. This time it was closer. They say once you've seen the shadows, they never truly leave. If you ever find an unmarked tape, will you risk playing it? Or will you wonder, what if it's already too late? Are you sure the shadows in your room aren't moving right now?